So this is the presentation that I gave at the McMullen Naval History Symposium 2019 at the U.S. Naval Academy in Annapolis. And this presentation is entitled Naval Aviation and the Grand Fleet, Airships to Aircraft Carriers. This presentation examines a major technological revolution that took place during the First World War, in which the Royal Navy essentially developed naval aviation, specifically fleet aviation, and in particular, the aircraft carrier and torpedo strike capability. I think this is a really important topic because it's something that is often overlooked in the history of military innovation later in the 20th century, specifically during the Second World War, when obviously Taranto and Pearl Harbor become sort of the models for what is thought of when people think about the subject of naval airstrike and aircraft carrier strike. However, as I prove in this presentation, the Royal Navy had actually worked out the principles, the technology, and the methods much earlier, really by 1917, 1918 in the First World War. And furthermore, the flying squadron of the Grand Fleet had actually become a coherent airstrike naval aviation force that had a profound impact on the war and would have had an even more significant impact had the war carried on past 1918. So this presentation discusses the history of naval aviation with Britain's Grand Fleet during the First World War. This is a pioneering story that begins with setbacks and uncertainty, but concludes with revolution. The presentation demonstrates that the Royal Navy in fact mastered aviation during the war, and the Grand Fleet was central to this evolution. Now, to be sure, the path from the Mayfly airship of 1911 to the Cuxhaven raid of Christmas Eve 1914, through to the climactic Tondern raid of 18 July 4 years later, was fraught with challenges. That new technology had to be carefully integrated into the fleet under a stringent regime of wartime prioritization, and the accidental and battlefield deaths of key pioneers disrupted the pace of technological progress. Indeed, one of the essential lessons of this story is the risks associated with failing to follow through with technological changes because of the loss or political isolation of essential personnel and in the midst of administrative upheaval, which are natural, of course, during wartime. Now, after 4 hard-fought years of industrial warfare, during which Britain's industrial base and home front were transformed by sweeping regulations, the Grand Fleet ended the war ready to carry out aerial torpedo strikes against the High Sea Fleet. The Admiralty's Air Department and the Grand Fleet's aviators had in fact invented, from the keel and fuselage up, not only the ships and aircraft, but also the ship's techniques and the training and establishment to operationalize aircraft carrier warfare. For the Admiralty, however, this revolution had come too late to save the Air Department. The creation of the Royal Air Force on April Fool's Day 1918 abolished the Navy's completely internalized, organic naval aviation organization, and ultimately doomed the Royal Naval Air Service to historical oblivion. In the short term, thankfully, the independent air organization, dominated by the Army's former Royal Flying Corps as it was, did not, however, significantly modify the immediate wartime tactical role of Britain's naval aviators, who, under the leadership of Richard Fillmore at the Flying Squadron, who was Admiral commanding aircraft there, continued to work closely with the fleet, despite their new military ranks and the uncertainty of their future organization. Now, this story starts before the war, however, indeed before the creation of the Royal Air Force in 1918, and even before the creation of the Royal Naval Air Service in July 1914. First, there was the Naval Wing, a pioneering military service that began as the twin branch of the Army's military wing of the incipient Third Service, the Royal Flying Corps. The Royal Navy's interest in naval aviation began early in the 20th century, starting with American Samuel Cody, whose kite experiments set the foundation for aviation as a naval technology, a fact that was accelerated by Louis Blériot's crossing of the English Channel and winning of the Daily Mail Prize in 1909. The same year, Charles Rolls purchased a Wright airplane on his own behalf. The British government was, however, relatively late to the game, having turned down the Wright brothers on several occasions between 1905 and 1908. The first concrete work towards the development of naval aviation was done by one Francis McLean, who donated land on the Isle of Sheppey in 1909 to the Aerial Club of Great Britain for use as a pilot training grounds, later relocated to Eastchurch, where was founded the primordial training establishment of the Naval Wing. In Germany, meanwhile, Count von Zeppelin's airship designs were rapidly improving in efficiency, promising to provide the growing German Navy with an unprecedented communication, reconnaissance, and command and control platform. High-flying Zeppelins, equipped with powerful wireless telegraphy sets, could not only see over the oceanic horizon, but could also communicate with the fleet's commander, providing invaluable intelligence regarding enemy dispositions. Improvements in fire control technology only increased the theoretical value of the airships, as they could potentially provide the surface ships with much-needed gunnery data, and thus represented the kind of technological advantage that Germany's Kaiserliche Marine needed to even up the scales against an overwhelming Royal Navy. Britain's naval leadership, including Admiral Sir John Fisher, First Sea Lord until 1911, and Winston Churchill, First Lord of the Admiralty in the Asquith government that same year, were quick to perceive this. Fisher wrote to Churchill that, quote, "Aviation supersedes small cruisers and intelligence vessels," end quote, a position Churchill took seriously. The obvious way to address the technological uncertainty surrounding the new air technology was to develop Britain's own rigid airships, to provide an indigenous Royal Navy capability that would enable the service leadership to determine the true potential of the airship platform. Adopting such a complex and unprecedented technology required sustained investment in infrastructure, cutting-edge science and technologies, including advances in aerodynamics and metallurgy, all of which the Royal Navy, in fact, as the preeminent technological organization of the British state, was well placed to address. The Navy, after all, had already developed and integrated things such as submarines, torpedoes, mines, wireless telegraphy, fire control systems, turbine engines, amongst other ceaseless improvements, including advances in cannon and armor, into the fleet, and thus the aerial dimension fit as part of a natural progression for the Navy's technical specialists. It was Lord Raleigh, first chairman of the Advisory Committee for Aeronautics in 1908, a body including the Director of Naval Ordnance, Captain Reginald Bacon, along with the Inspecting Captain of Airships, Captain Murray Suter, who collectively recommended the development of naval rigid airships. On 21 July that year, Bacon proposed to First Sea Lord Fisher that Britain should begin the development of an airship program. Fisher immediately put Bacon in charge of the project. Now, Bacon was an experienced submarine and torpedo expert, who drew inspiration from the submarine specialists he had worked with in the past, including Captain Suter. Suter's role in the airship project was to act as the Admiralty's representative with the Vickers armaments firm, who were tapped to manage construction. Bacon believed the Navy's airships would require a speed of about 40 knots, an operational ceiling of 1,500 feet, and technical fittings including wireless telegraphy, interior telephone communications, and a reconnaissance camera to be made by the Zeiss Corporation in Germany. On 28 July 1909, the Committee of Imperial Defense budgeted £35,000 for construction of an airship, plus another £50,000 for the cost of the shed. This £85,000 expenditure represented little more than the cost of a single destroyer, about £80,000, and only one-fifth the cost of a single light cruiser, roughly £400,000. On 9 May, the contract with Vickers was signed and construction began. Progress was slow, in fact over budget, and the airship was not completed until May 1911. Bacon, who was so valuable for leading the Navy's side of the airship project, had retired in November 1909 to become managing director of the Coventry Ordnance Works, leaving Suter to take over the airship project. After completion, it was found that the airship was deficient in lift, and so elements of the superstructure were removed. Unfortunately for the rigid airship program, the experimental duraluminum frame was wrecked when the spine split in half as the airship was being moved from its Cavendish shed on a windy 24 September. Rear Admiral Frederick Sturdy, one of Admiral Fisher's numerous critics, presided over the subsequent inquiry that was convened on 18 October, and unsurprisingly, Sturdy was quick to condemn the entire project as misguided. This was a near-fatal blow to the Royal Navy's rigid airship program. You can see on this archival document here, which is related to Sturdy's chairmanship of the inquiry committee, he's written to Suter, "I do not know what the Admiralty are preparing to do, but I privately advise them not to repair your monster." That is to say, although he's kind of letting Suter off the hook as far as responsibility for the Mayfly disaster goes, he's definitely saying that he doesn't believe in further airship development and you should forget about the project. That was on 31st October 1911. It was not until a year later that renewed interest in airship development convinced the CID, that is Committee of Imperial Defense, to procure several semi-rigid airships, which you can see on the right-hand side here, the Astra Torres class and the Parseval class, to be licensed built from French and German designs. Vickers, meanwhile, would commence work on another full-scale rigid airship. Now, with the rigid airship program stalled following the Mayfly disaster, the Navy began to search for alternatives. Logically enough, the simplest short-term solution was to use airplanes, cheap, disposable, and comparatively uncomplicated, to fill in for the missing airships. Swarms of small airplanes might, in aggregate, make up for the more expensive rigid airships. Towards this end, the protected cruiser HMS Hermes was converted to carry several seaplanes so as to simulate a rigid airship's scouting capabilities at the 1913 naval maneuvers. These maneuvers exposed the advantages and disadvantages of aircraft operating with the fleet. Captain G.W. Vivian, who commanded Hermes at the maneuvers, reported that seaplanes in fact had difficulty communicating with warships, given their low-powered, transmitter-only portable wireless sets. And furthermore, the fragile seaplanes had difficulty ascending or alighting from the water in anything but calm conditions. The deploying or recovering seaplane carrier, likewise, was obliged to stop during this process, thus making it an ideal target for potential torpedo boats or submarines. Now, on the other hand, it was discovered that the seaplanes could effectively communicate with their shore naval bases, and, given favorable enough conditions, with nearby destroyers, which made them potentially a very useful scouting auxiliary. In October 1913, after the maneuvers, Hermes was paid off and placed in reserve while a more permanent solution was explored. Captain Vivian wrote up a report, which he then submitted to the Admiralty, and which today can be viewed in his archives. Now, indeed, well, the Hermes experiment proved that the airplanes could be useful in the naval fleet role. What was really needed were additional airships, and as we've seen, these were hesitantly being developed by the Air Department. Now, although the energy notable during the years before the Mayfly disaster had dissipated with Bacon's retirement and Captain Suter being shut down, as it were, by Frederick Sturdy, Suter was soon back. Although relieved of being captain of airships in February 1912, in May 1912, he was appointed by Churchill, who was now taking flying lessons with the Naval Air Service himself, as the director of the newly created Air Department. In July, Suter, together with Colonel Morven O'Gorman of the Royal Aircraft Factory, were dispatched on an interesting espionage mission to Europe with the intent of profiling continental airship development. Disguised as Americans, the two toured airship facilities in France, Germany, and Austria, and indeed flew in the Zeppelin Victoria Louis, and upon return produced a dossier on Zeppelin capabilities that was well received. Churchill, who had by now personally taken flying lessons with the Naval Wing, as I've said, was charmed by the romance of flying, and so was set on the development of long-range seaplanes, which he believed could potentially reproduce many of the functions of the Coast Guard. This is an interesting theory which initially Suter did not agree with, but after some pressure from Churchill came around to. The idea being that, naturally enough, seaplanes could cover much greater ground, that is sea, coast, as it were, than Coast Guard ships, and could, through their landing capability, potentially rescue individuals lost at sea. This meant, of course, that enraptured with the aircraft, seaplane aspect, of which the term seaplane was actually coined by Churchill as a replacement for the less wieldy hydro aeroplane, this meant that airships were not a priority for Churchill. So, however, Suter, being formerly inspecting captain of airships and the core designer for the Mayfly, was still interested in developing the rigid airship. And he in fact succeeded in securing funding for a second rigid, now known as the R9, which would be 890,000 cubic feet, and the contract for which was signed with Vickers in March 1914. The outbreak of the war, however, frustrated these efforts. Although Churchill, and after 31st October 1914, First Sea Lord Admiral Fisher, who returned from his retirement, introduced the small Sea Scout blimp and the larger coastal and North Sea type rigid airships for anti-submarine work, they did not prioritize rigid airship development during their tenure. That is to say, they were developing these small non-rigid blimps and coastal airships to act as what Fisher in fact described as submarine destroyers. However, these were slow, small, and did not carry any of the interior equipment or have the range that would have made them useful for fleet work, as was the expected case with rigid airship technology. Now, unfortunately for the Fisher and Churchill regime, the Asquith government was weakened by the infamous Shell scandal, amongst other problems, including the costly Second Battle of Ypres and the failed Dardanelles landing of 25 April 1915. The latter a bitter pill to swallow, made worse for Fisher by the loss of the pre-dreadnought battleships Goliath, Triumph, and Majestic in May. Now, the resulting May crisis was triggered, in fact, by Fisher, who resigned and forced the Asquith government, that is to say, Prime Minister H.H. Asquith himself, to accept opposition unionists into top cabinet positions. Churchill was, as a result, forced to go and was replaced by former Prime Minister Arthur Balfour as First Lord of the Admiralty. He was joined by Admiral Sir Henry Jackson as First Sea Lord. Jackson was a noted technocrat and a wireless pioneer. It was believed that the Jackson-Balfour administration would provide a sense of calm, being as these were very conservative but intellectual people, in opposition to the former Churchill-Fisher regime, which was volcanic, naturally, in its ambition and technocratic interests. Balfour, in fact, was a firm believer in classic naval roles, including coastal defense, and thus expanded on many of the established policies and choices made by his predecessor. He did, however, importantly, in September 1915, replace Souter with Rear Admiral Charles Vaughan Lee, who became the new Director of Air Services. At the behest of the Grand Fleet CNC, now Admiral Sir John Jellicoe in replacement of Callahan, the Balfour-Jackson duo quickly resurrected the rigid airship project. Work was resumed on airship R9 in August 1915, and a series of new rigids, known as the R-23 class, were ordered. Vickers was to build R-23 and R-26, Beardmore R-24, and Armstrong Whitworth R-25, to be followed by 4 additional ships for a total of 8 new airships on order by January 1916. Vaughan and Lee then expanded this order to 11 ships in March of 1916, hoping to ultimately have 12 Zeppelin-type airships available for work with the Grand Fleet. Now, before these tumultuous events had taken place, we have to return to the beginning of the war. The 1913 maneuvers had shown the potential for heavier-than-air aviation with the fleet, and so the Admiralty Board appointed Vice Admiral Jellicoe, at this time still the second Sea Lord, and nominally responsible for fleet aviation, with the task of finding a suitable merchant ship for conversion to a dedicated seaplane carrier. This effort, for which £81,000 was secured, commenced in May 1914, when a steamer under construction at the Blythe Yards was redesigned by John Narbeth, the Assistant Director of Naval Construction. The result of this conversion was the specialized seaplane carrier HMS Ark Royal, that upon entering service in January 1915, was, however, immediately dispatched to the Mediterranean as part of the Dardanelles expedition. This meant that the Grand Fleet, with only 3 cross-channel converted ferries, Engadine, Riviera, and Empress, which were all requisitioned from the Southeastern and Chatham Railway Company on 11 August, was not terribly well fitted to deliver air support for the enormous Grand Fleet. The Grand Fleet itself also was soon equipped with the converted RMS Campania, which was purchased on an old Cunard liner that was purchased on 27 November 1914 and hastily converted before it was commissioned as a seaplane carrier on 17 April 1915. Although additional seaplane carriers joined the fleet in driblets as the war progressed, Jellicoe, as Grand Fleet CNC, was annoyed by what seemed to him like glacial movement on the part of the Admiralty and the Air Department. The RNAS, in truth, was engaged in a multifaceted series of campaigns, including coastal patrol, home defense, and long-range bombing missions, all of which absorbed resources needed by the fleet. Thus, fleet aviation took a relatively minor priority here. With the Balfour-Jackson administration now renewing airship development, and Rear Admiral Vaughan Lee committed to expanding Britain's coastal air bases, Jellicoe was, however, hopeful that he would receive the air reinforcements he needed. He might not be able to rely on his converted ferries and old Cunard liner seaplane carriers, but if he could, in fact, get the airships he wanted, everything would be just hunky-dory. Now, more than just coastal seaplanes, the Grand Fleet needed carriers it could take to sea. And as early as July 1915, Jellicoe had become skeptical that seaplanes deployed from Campania would indeed be useful in combat. Slow experimental progress was being made, however, and Campania was in fact fitted with a forward flying off-deck, enabling seaplanes equipped with disposable wheels to be launched without having to stop and deploy. The aged Campania, however, was constantly under repair and was back at Liverpool for repairs in November 1915, only rejoining the fleet on 12th April 1916. The Grand Fleet was clearly facing a naval aviation disadvantage in comparison to the High Sea Fleet with its reliable and numerous Zeppelins. To address this asymmetry, at the beginning of the war, First Sea Lord of the Admiralty Churchill had planned to use the nascent Royal Naval Air Service to degrade Germany's Zeppelin bases, a high-technology extrapolation of the Navy's traditional anti-base strategy, really going back to the Cadiz raid of 1587, and represented in many numerous naval battles subsequently. The feasibility of Churchill's project was demonstrated by the Royal Naval Air Service when they conducted bombing raids against Dusseldorf on 22nd September and 9 October. The latter mission, which was a great success, in which Lieutenant Reggie Merrickx destroyed Army Zeppelin Z9 in its shed. The Friedrichshafen Zeppelin facility was raided without success in November, and on Christmas Eve 1914, a group of seaplane carriers attached to Commodore Tyrwhitt's Harwich Force raided the Zeppelin shed at Cuxhaven, near the Wilhelmshaven High Seas Fleet base. No Zeppelins were destroyed in this engagement. However, additional raids were flown against Gontrode on 25 May 1915 and Evora on 7 June 1915, during which Flight Lieutenants Wilson and Mills destroyed LZ-38. Cuxhaven-style seaplane raids were later conducted against Hoyer in March 1916 and again against Tondern in May 1916. The latter raid was flown by seaplanes from HMS Vindex, supported by the battlecruiser fleet's HMS Engadine. Although the pilots failed to destroy the Zeppelin sheds that were their targets, the potential for naval aviation in the strike role was clear. The Grand Fleet CNC, however, from his vantage point aboard HMS Iron Duke, was deeply concerned as 1916 progressed. His only fleet carrier was at this time out of commission, and his frequent requests for additional air support appeared to be getting nowhere. Jellicoe worried that the Zeppelins, by providing stable gunfire spotting and communications to the High Sea Fleet, would give Germany a decisive advantage in any future naval battle. The CNC was convinced that a single Zeppelin would be equal to, quote, at least 2 light cruisers, end quote, and more so would be effectively invincible as his own seaplanes lacked the performance to counter the Zeppelins. Jellicoe considered it extremely improbable, in his words, quote, that our seaplanes could be used for this purpose in a fleet action, end quote. Although coastal defense arrangements were improving, Jellicoe was not convinced the Admiralty, with Rear Admiral Vaughan and Lee at the Air Department, was doing everything it could to meet the Grand Fleet's requirements. What was really needed, beyond the limited improvement to his existing converted carriers, were dedicated platforms capable of launching and recovering not only seaplanes, but also higher performance anti-Zeppelin airplanes. On 8 May 1916, Jellicoe submitted to the Admiralty a proposal for a 27-knot seaplane carrier, a design that featured both flying off and flying on platforms. Jellicoe consulted with Captain Oliver Schwann of Campania, and both were in agreement that the suggested vessel filled their fleet requirements. The Admiralty, not surprisingly however, poured cold water on the proposal, pointing out that wartime priority did not allow for the immediate construction of such experimental vessels, but conceded that design details would be investigated further. In the meantime, focus was on the potential conversion of the 3 ships of the Courageous class for possible seaplane work. These were so-called light battlecruisers devised by Admiral Fisher for his supposed Baltic project, of which they were fast, lightly armored, and equipped with really large caliber but limited gunpowder, which might therefore make them very useful in terms of conversion to aircraft carriers. They could keep up with the Grand Fleet and the battlecruisers, for example. Efforts to improve the Grand Fleet's air capacity were delayed when Admiral Scheer, that is the German High Sea Fleet commander, at last sortied to challenge the Royal Navy in battle on 31st May 1916. As far as the development of naval aviation was concerned, the Battle of Jutland seemed to vindicate Jellicoe's concerns. Campania, equipped at this time with 10 seaplanes, 7 Sopwith single-seaters and 3 Short Brothers two-seaters, and a Caco fixed balloon, received the CNC's orders to prepare for a sortie at 5:35 p.m. on 30 May. Traffic caused while the fleet was leaving Scapa Flow, however, delayed Campania, and the carrier's commander, Captain Schwann, was unable to depart harbor until after 12 a.m. on 31st May. This meant he was the last out of Scapa Flow, and sailing as he was without destroyer escort in what were in fact U-boat-infested waters was a non-starter for Jellicoe, and he ordered Campania back to Scapa Flow at 4:37 a.m. The Grand Fleet, as a result, went into battle without the battle fleet's only aircraft carrier. Captain Schwann also missed Admiral Scheer's August sortie as the aged Campania was once again laid up for repairs. HMS Engadine, under Lieutenant Commander C.G. Robinson, did, however, sortie from Rosyth at 10 p.m. on 30 May, alongside the rest of the battlecruiser force, and the seaplane carrier indeed played a small role in the battle. Just after 2:40 p.m., Vice Admiral Beatty, commanding the battlecruisers aboard HMS Lion, ordered Engadine to perform seaplane reconnaissance to the northeast. This turned out to be Engadine's only sortie at Jutland, which was flown by Flight Lieutenant F.J. Rutland and Assistant Paymaster G.S. Trewin, who utilized their short 184's 60-mile range Rosette wireless set to transmit contact reports back to Engadine. Rutland and Trewin had indeed observed elements of the High Sea Fleet's cruiser screen and reported as much. At 3:30 p.m., they spotted, quote, 3 enemy cruisers and 5 destroyers, distance from us 10 miles bearing 90 degrees, steering course northwest, quote. A few minutes later, Trewin updated the enemy's direction to the southward, and at 3:45 he described a formation that now included 10 destroyers and a 4th cruiser a few minutes later. Just after sending this final contact report, the seaplane's petrol pipe broke, and Rutland was forced to turn back to Engadine. They landed not long afterwards, and although the defective pipe was quickly repaired, they had been hoisted aboard at 4 p.m. and did not take any further part in the battle. Now, these contact reports, which in fact had described elements of the High Sea Fleet's 2nd Scouting Group, were received by Lieutenant Commander Robinson aboard Engadine. They were not successfully relayed, as they would have had to have been by signal lamp, back to Beatty aboard Lion. Now, this was ultimately of no major consequence, as the cruiser HMS Galatea had independently reported the 2nd Scouting Group's movements at 3:44 p.m. So ended the role of naval aviation at the Battle of Jutland. Now, this relatively limited experience at Jutland left much to be desired. Although the promise of naval aviation had been demonstrated under battle conditions, Jellicoe was still keen to receive the rigid airships he really wanted, more reliable and stable than their airplane counterparts. On 24 September 1916, the Zeppelin L-33 was shot down while it was raiding England over Essex, and investigation of the wreck demonstrated to the Air Department's Airship Division that existing British rigid designs were drastically inferior to the new Super Zeppelins that Germany was manufacturing. The German Zeppelin type was hastily reverse-engineered from the wreckage of L-33, and 2 copies were ordered by the Admiralty in November 1916, followed by 3 more in January 1917. Additional design details were revealed when L-48 was brought down over Suffolk on 17 June 1917, and the Allies scored a major coup when they captured L-49 intact in France on 20 October that year. The result was the R-33 class, to which progressive improvements were made up to R-41, which was ordered in June 1918. The much delayed and now technically obsolete R-9 was at last inflated in November 1916, but, like the Mayfly before it, was found to be deficient in lift and was thus lightened over the winter, finally becoming operational only in April 1917. R-26 and its successors entered commission on a monthly basis between March and July 1918, but these were used exclusively in the training and anti-submarine roles, rather than for fleet operations. The advanced R-33 class, built by Armstrong, and the R-34, built by Beardmore, began flight trials in the spring of 1918, the latter being accepted by the Navy and deployed to East Fortune on 29 May. These were quite excellent airships, and essentially fulfilled Jellicoe's dream of receiving the British Zeppelins that he wanted for the fleet, but obviously they came into operation far too late to affect the war. Indeed, arguably, they were obsolete by this time, as the Grand Fleet's aircraft carriers, which we'll talk about in just a minute, along with the aircraft, which fired by now explosive bullets against large hydrogen-filled balloons, clearly made the Zeppelins, that is the British airships, now too risky to be usefully employed. So the airships had finally been developed, but long after they'd really reached a period at which they would be useful. In other words, they were effectively military obsolete by the end of the war. Now, while the airship force was building up during 1917, the Grand Fleet thus still faced a capability gap. At the beginning of that year, Jellicoe departed the Grand Fleet for the Admiralty as First Sea Lord. His mandate, of course, was to counter the submarine crisis. Admiral Beatty succeeded Jellicoe at the Grand Fleet and brought a renewed determination to address the Grand Fleet's inadequate naval aviation force. The Grand Fleet battle orders that Beatty inherited from Jellicoe had provided only for seaplane reconnaissance and limited kite balloon gunfire spotting, and not much more. This was understandable, of course, as the Grand Fleet, when Beatty took over, possessed only 24 aircraft. 12 reconnaissance seaplanes and 12 anti-Zeppelin fighters carried collectively aboard Campania and Gedine and Manxman. HMS Nirana and Pegasus, additional converted ferries, were added to the fleet as a stopgap, but what was desperately needed were dedicated carriers, capable of launching and recovering aircraft. Not just seaplanes, that is. To address the lack of dedicated carriers, Beatty convened the Grand Fleet Air Committee under the chairmanship of Rear Admiral Hugh Evan Thomas, who was the commander of the 5th Battle Squadron. After a month of meetings, the Air Committee presented its report on 5 February 1917. Beatty approved of the report and forwarded it to the Admiralty, where it was circulated for comment during the first week of March. The Air Committee's most significant recommendation was that the fast battlecruiser, HMS Furious, one of the Courageous class discussed earlier, then still under construction at the Armstrong Whitworth Yard at Elswick, should be converted to an aircraft carrier. Rather than being completed with its forward 18-inch gun, the forecastle was converted into a 228-foot flying-off deck, and on 26 June, Furious was added to the Grand Fleet under the command of Captain Wilmot Nicholson, with the experienced squadron commander E.H. Dunning as his senior flying officer. Furious was equipped to carry 3 short 184s and 5 Sopwith Pup aircraft. Dunning, a veteran and experienced pioneer, was, however, tragically killed on 7 August while landing on Furious's foredeck, after having made 2 successful landing attempts the previous days. This disaster led to the suspension of landing attempts and the decision to remove Furious's stern gun so that a proper landing deck could be installed. On 14 November, Furious returned to the dockyards for these additional modifications. While Furious was undergoing its second modification, and with the rigid airships now nearing completion, Beatty believed the Grand Fleet should consider the proposals that were floating around calling for a naval airstrike against the High Sea Fleet base at Wilhelmshaven. This ambitious effort to use naval aviation to shape the war in a strategic sense had at its core the objective of disrupting the High Sea Fleet's ability to protect Germany's U-boat bases. If the German battle fleet could be crippled in harbor, it would free the Grand Fleet to execute a closer blockade and perhaps even cover amphibious operations against the U-boat bases themselves. There were a number of experienced naval practitioners, including Commodore Suter, Flight Lieutenant Rutland, now of Jutland, 3rd Sea Lord Rear Admiral Lionel Halsey, Captain Herbert Richmond, Flight Commander Hugh Williamson, and of course Beatty himself, who endorsed this audacious concept of operations. Now, the earliest proposal for an airstrike against Wilhelmshaven had in fact been put forward by one Squadron Commander de Courcy, Ireland, the commanding officer of the Great Yarmouth Naval Air Station, who circulated a theoretical plan in December 1915. At that time, Ireland had advocated an attack against the German fleet in Wilhelmshaven, Cuxhaven, and Kiel by torpedo to be delivered from seaplanes, with a possible operational date of June or July 1916. As a result of this memo, Director Air Services Vaughan Lee had called a conference on 4 January 1916 to discuss the matter of torpedo aircraft, and in this conference, the subject of attacking Wilhelmshaven was considered. De Courcy, Ireland was, however, like Dunning as well, killed in an experimental airplane accident on 21 February 1916, and the plan evaporated. He was actually killed while he was working, I believe it was with Naval Osborne, who was a airship pioneer. And they were testing a airship plane concept. Again, this just highlights that when you rely on 1 or 2 individuals to run a training regime, an experimental training regime, and then they're killed in an accident, you lose so much potential and experience that it's almost irreplaceable. And this really tells you something about the risks associated with innovation in wartime. Of course, people are now under increased pressure because they need to innovate in ways that will impact the war, which means they're taking greater risks, and therefore the risk of accident is even higher. This really just says, I think, that it's important, if possible, to try to innovate before the war, so that way you can do it in a safer environment and without potentially losing all of this skill. So despite the death of Ireland, Beatty was looking at these proposals that were now circulating, that is in 1917, for the Wilhelmshaven strike. Eager to generate some offensive action, Beatty now renewed the idea in 1917 and together with Jellicoe and senior Grand Fleet personnel, discussed the proposal aboard HMS Queen Elizabeth, that is the Grand Fleet flagship, on 24 August 1917. Beatty recalled that Rutland had suggested methods for a Wilhelmshaven attack, and shortly afterwards, Beatty met with Captain Richmond, who also endorsed the plan. With strong backing from these audacious young Turks, Beatty went to London to discuss the plan with the Admiralty leadership, and on 11 September he submitted a detailed proposal requesting 120 torpedo planes launched from 8 converted merchant ships. Unfortunately, September 1917 was also the climactic phase of the submarine crisis, when converted merchant ships would be at a premium, and it became clear, let alone that is the 120 seaplanes, it became clear that the operation was not be feasible in the near future. Indeed, a viable torpedo airplane did not yet exist. Although Suter had been working with the Sopwith Corporation on the T-1 Cuckoo aircraft, one of the first torpedo bombers, the first deliveries of which were not expected until April 1918. Thus, although the visionary Wilhelmshaven plan ultimately fizzled out, it did emphasize the need for improvement in the material conditions of the Grand Fleet's aviation. Improvements that, in fact, were about to come to fruition with the formation of the Grand Fleet's Flying Squadron. The formation of the Flying Squadron stands out as the culmination of the Grand Fleet's naval aviation revolution. Beatty, encouraged by the recommendations of the commander of the 1st Battle Cruiser Squadron, Rear Admiral Richard Phillimore, decided to centralize the Grand Fleet's aviation assets into a single unit, separate and distinct from the planning that was then underway for the Wilhelmshaven strike. On 19 November, 2 days after the Second Battle of Heligoland Bight, Beatty formed the position of Rear Admiral Air, quickly changed to ACA, or Admiral Commanding Aircraft, who would act as an advisor and deputy to the CNC. Beatty wanted this new deputy to be in direct consultation with the Admiralty's air representative, who was now the 5th Sea Lord, Commodore Godfrey Payne. 1 month later, Beatty appointed Richard Phillimore as the commander of the new Flying Squadron, which would use HMS Furious, once its refit was complete, as the squadron flagship. The Flying Squadron itself first appeared in the January 1918 issue of the Grand Fleet Battle Orders, at which time it was composed of Furious, Campania, Pegasus, and Irana. Beatty, in fact, had pulled off a major coup. He had been informed by the decision of the War Cabinet on 24 August 1917 that the Air Ministry was soon, that is in January 1918, to be created, with the formation of the Royal Air Force clearly soon to follow. By creating the Flying Squadron, Beatty ensured that the Grand Fleet's naval aviators would remain under his direct control. To maintain harmony between air and naval personnel, Phillimore would be supported by senior Air Force officers, in this case Lieutenant Colonel Richard Bell Davis as senior flying officer, with Lieutenant Colonel Robert Clark Hall as Phillimore's chief of staff under the designation Fleet Aviation Officer Grand Fleet. Both of these were excellent practitioners. Richard Bell Davis had worked with Wing Captain Elder as head of the bombing wing then at Luxelle in 1916-1917, and Robert Clark Hall had been captain of the Ark Royal at the Dardanelles. So these were very experienced aircraft and aircraft carrier operators. On 15 March 1918, the modifications to Furious were completed, and Phillimore, who was an experienced battlecruiser commander, transferred his flag from HMS Repulse to the Furious, which was now fitted with a 280-foot landing deck aft, although landing trials during March and April proved too dangerous for routine operations. This was sort of the long legacy of Dunning's death. Even though they'd actually improved the landing conditions aboard Furious, the risks were still too great to allow routine operation. So the concept of operations would be that while Furious could launch aircraft, the pilots would be safer ditching and then being recovered by the seaplane carriers. So the seaplane carriers here provided a key role in that they had to be mobile and out to recover the pilots. So although and then if the airplanes could be recovered, those could also be brought back aboard. Now Furious was finally ready for operations. There were other conversions going on, of course, and the Italian liner Conto Rosso was being converted into HMS Argus. This was an important conversion as Argus would be flush-decked, meaning it could definitely launch and recover aircraft without having to ditch. And this would enable the launching and recovering of torpedo planes, absolutely essential if the naval strike role is going to go through. Furthermore, two additional carriers were being constructed, the battleship conversion HMS Eagle and the keel-up flat-top HMS Hermes. Fillmore and Beatty, both aggressive battlecruiser commanders, were eager to put the flying squadron to the test, and so a series of North Sea patrols were organized. With its high-performance Sopwith aircraft, Furious could not only intercept Zeppelins in flight, but could also conduct scouting over the High Sea Fleet's defensive minefields. Landing, as I've said, however, was a dodgy affair, with aircraft ditching generally before the pilots would be recovered by the seaplane carriers. The flying squadron's greatest wartime success was the Tondern raid, carried out on 19 July 1918. The German airships, as we have seen, were a source of unending concern for the Royal Navy throughout the war. And carrier raids had been attempted against the Tondern base on several occasions before, specifically in May 1916. Fillmore's staff now dedicated their efforts towards devising a scheme for attacking the Tondern sheds. Unlike the previous attempts, airplanes, organized and flown by experienced pilots, would now be used. Robert Clark Hall and Richard Bell Davis set to work devising the attack plan, which was approved by Fillmore and submitted to Beatty on 21 June. The operation was to commence at 3 a.m., or as soon as light conditions permitted, with the attackers flying in at low altitude in their naval Sopwith camels, known as 2F1s, each camel carrying two 50-pound bombs. The selected pilots were instructed not to penetrate neutral airspace, although they were authorized to land in Germany or Denmark if they were short on fuel. Engaging enemy airplanes, considering the critical nature of the objective, was to be avoided, although the pilots were authorized to engage any Zeppelins encountered in flight. The operation, known as F-7 for the 7th Flying Squadron mission, commenced on 17 July. Beatty provided Fillmore with the latest Grand Fleet intelligence, relating that the target consisted of 2 small sheds and 1 large shed, also possibly a second large shed. In fact, the facility was 4 sheds, 2 large, 2 small. And the Furious Task Force was designated as Force A, including the 1st Light Cruiser Squadron with supporting destroyers, and assisted by a covering force designated Force B, and including the 1st Battle Squadron and 7th Light Cruiser Squadron with destroyers. The important point here is that the flying squadron has actually become the centerpiece of operations. The aircraft carrier is being supported by battleships and light cruisers and destroyers, which is, of course, the model that eventually evolves for the battle group formation. At 3 a.m. on 18 July 1918, Furious was prepared to launch its aircraft, but Fillmore made the decision to delay for 24 hours due to a thunderstorm. A second attempt was made on 19 July, and Furious successfully launched 2 flights, 7 Sopwith Camels in total, with only 1 aircraft turning back due to mechanical error. The bombers got through to the target and successfully destroyed Zeppelins L-54 and L-60 in their shed, 2 of the 5 Zeppelins destroyed by naval pilots during 1918. Of the 6 pilots who made the attack, 4 failed to return, although Lieutenant W.A. Hewlett, who disappeared at sea, was the only actual casualty. The rest of the pilots had landed in Denmark before variously making their way back to Britain. They were able to do this because they were considered technically as wrecked mariners, and thus they were not actually prisoners of war or even necessarily violators of neutrality. Tondern was a brilliant success, demonstrating that the Grand Fleet had internalized the operational and tactical doctrine required to make carrier strike routine. The flying squadron, in fact, had surpassed the Zeppelins that had been the source of so much concern during most of the war. The flying squadron, furthermore, was a growth investment, and as the Tondern operation demonstrated, with group cover, the aircraft carriers could be used to launch strike missions against the enemy's naval bases, potentially far behind Germany's protective minefields. Before long, the aborted Wilhelmshaven raid might become a reality. HMS Argus, the flush-deck carrier designed to launch and recover the Sopwith T-1 torpedo bombers, had made this plan now possible. Argus joined the flying squadron in October 1918, sporting a 560-foot flush flight deck. The converted light cruiser HMS Cavendish, now vindictive after the Zeebrugge raid of 23 April, also joined the flying squadron in October. So October represents a major improvement for the flying squadron. It now contains 2 big, fast aircraft carriers, Furious and Vindictive, plus the slower but critically launching and landing capable HMS Argus, in addition to the assorted seaplane carriers. The Sopwith T-1 Cuckoo aircraft of RAF number 185 Squadron, formed at East Fortune on 21 October 1918, provided the flying squadron with this revolutionary strike capability. The world's first operational torpedo bomber squadron was preparing for its debut strike against the High Sea Fleet when the war ended. Now, at this time, to borrow historian Eric Grove's phrase, the Grand Fleet was awash with aircraft. The flying squadron's carriers provided up to 65 aircraft, and turret launching platforms for 2 aircraft each were fitted to 29 battleships and 7 battle cruisers, with another 28 cruisers and light cruisers fitted with single revolving or fixed launching platforms to equip Sopwith Camels, Pups, and Beardmore WB-3s for a total potential of 165 air and seaplanes carried organically by the fleet, a number only slightly reduced by the accidental sinking of Campania in November when it collided with the battleship HMS Revenge. Kind of a sad but symbolic end to the Campania, which had spent so much time, done so much during the war to train up and develop naval aviation with the fleet. Now, furthermore, in addition to these 165 aircraft carried by the aircraft carriers and launched by the battleships and so on, mass-produced lighters towed behind destroyers had been demonstrated as capable of launching Sopwith Pups and Felixstowe flying boats. Thus, the entire flying establishment was also supported by extensive coastal bases, and all of this, although it was now under the domain of the Royal Air Force and indeed the Air Ministry, provided an enormous aircraft strike, reconnaissance, gunfire spotting, and interceptor capability to the fleet, unmatched by any naval force. This was an impressive display of naval air power, and like I say, truly a revolution in technology that had occurred by the end of the war. The flying squadron was indeed preparing for its denouement, the Wilhelmshaven strike plan, and although entirely feasible by October 1918, had been made redundant by the German naval mutiny as the war came to a close. Eager to prove their mettle nevertheless, the concept was actually demonstrated the following year on 6 September 1919 during naval exercises in which the Argus torpedo bombers conducted a mock attack against the Royal Navy's Atlantic Fleet battleships. T-1s of the Torpedo Development Unit, formerly number 816 Squadron Gosport, carried out the attack, and were deemed to in fact have scored several hits, albeit without the difficulty of facing enemy fire. The flying squadron was soon disbanded during the post-war demobilization, but the lessons were clear. Aviation had transformed naval battle, no longer the uncertain auxiliary of 1914, but now the decisive striking wing of the fleet itself. So this has been a story of technological evolution and the difficulty of managing uncertainty. Although the Mayfly disaster caused a major setback for the development of naval aviation with the fleet, accidents with experimental technology were unavoidable, certainly, and even common during the pioneering days of aviation. Uncertainty about the role of the Zeppelin within German fleet tactics had forced the Royal Navy to respond, but there was no clear way forward after the Mayfly had been wrecked. Churchill believed airplanes could fill that gap. In the event, the Royal Navy fought the entire war without the airships the Grand Fleet leadership requested, although ultimately Germany's Zeppelins played only a minor role in terms of North Sea naval combat, and were instead employed primarily, as we know, as bombers against British cities in what was actually a misguided effort to weaken Britain's resolve to carry on with the war. It's important to point out that when you drop bombs on civilians, you tend to encourage the nation being bombed not to give up. And furthermore, there's a tendency to, especially when you're bombing large cities like London, to kill the citizens of neutral parties. Thus, strategic bombing indiscriminately, that is not against, say, industrial targets or military targets, is generally counterproductive. Airplanes certainly did indeed supplant airships as the primary aerial component of the fleet, but the capability gap created when the rigid airship program was delayed meant that Britain was constantly playing catch-up. Experimental technological development during wartime was exceedingly difficult and costly, contrary to claims that technology progresses rapidly in wartime. It does so only in a very narrow way, and at great cost both in terms of money and lives. The numerous cases of accidental deaths caused during prototype development meant the loss of irreplaceable talent, as I've tried to stress. Ultimately, though the Grand Fleet did evolve a complex and powerful air component, not only in the form of the flying squadron, but also integrated in terms of aircraft with each ship of the fleet and in terms of coastal defense and patrol as well. Also, obviously, in terms of anti-submarine warfare, which we can't even touch on here, although I've done a separate talk on that as a subject as well. Naval aviation before the war had been considered an uncertain auxiliary, an aid to gunnery perhaps, and a useful command and control platform, but experimental, dangerous, and unreliable. By the summer of 1918, the former officers and airmen of the Royal Naval Air Service, now the aviators of the Royal Air Force, attached to the Grand Fleet and Phillamore's flying squadron, had developed a strike capability that could indeed produce real strategic impact and was certainly unprecedented in the world's navies. There was no mystery about it. The naval aviators knew what they needed to do, and once the equipment had at long last been supplied, were able to convert what had essentially been a battleship navy into a carrier force within a few months. Political will and administrative prioritization were the real stumbling blocks, and once these hurdles were overcome, the Grand Fleet's transformation was enthusiastic and total. Britain, in fact, had become a naval air power.